Hello and welcome to the Wedding Guide podcast. I'm your host, Pete the Celebrant, and we are proudly sponsored by Easy Weddings. Easy Weddings helps thousands of couples nail their big day every year. With their award-winning directory and mobile apps, you can find and book top-rated wedding suppliers, stay on track with their planning tools, or for a more hands-off approach, work with a wedding planner to save you time and money. And it's free. Jump onto easyweddings.com.au to start your stress-free journey up the aisle today. In this episode of the podcast, we meet Jane Libbis, a lawyer who specialises in family law at Umbrella Family Law. She helps people who are separating start their new life. We discuss legal options for couples, including prenuptial agreements, and how to set yourselves up for a successful marriage. Allow me to introduce you to the very compassionate Jane Libbis. Well, hello and welcome to another episode. And today we are joined by Jane from Umbrella Law. Jane, how are you?
Oh my God, I'm so great. I'm so glad to be here with you, Pete. It's wonderful to be doing this with you.
So good. You know, one thing that listeners wouldn't know is that the podcasting idea actually came out of a conversation we had
a long time ago.
Would have been some time last year, like early last year or something.
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
We were sitting in, where was it? Lygon Street. I think it was Lygon Street.
We were.
Just having some coffees in the afternoon, and it was great. It's we're opposite ends of the spectrum here, you know. And we met originally through a networking group, and I jokingly used to say, "I make 'em, Jane breaks 'em," which is not true.
Which makes me sound so evil, Pete.
It does, which is why it's not true. But why don't you jump in and tell us who you are, tell us about Umbrella Law and what you do.
Sure. So I'm Jane from Umbrella Family Law. We started a couple of years ago, and our mission is to help people who are separating to start their new life. We do all of the things that family lawyers do, and at Umbrella, we do it with great passion and heart. It's really our goal to make sure that our clients are comfortable as they start on that journey from being two to becoming one and coming out the other side of a separation. So we help them with all of the practical things arising from separation from a legal perspective, time with their kids, property settlement, ultimately divorce if they've been married. And we also deal with people who are at your end of the spectrum. We also help people with prenuptial agreements who are wanting to protect their assets in the event that they should separate.
And that is a perfect segue to my next question, because I've always wanted to know, what is a prenuptial agreement, or prenup, as they say?
Yes, often called prenup. So essentially, and also it doesn't actually have to be entered into before your nuptials. It can be entered into after your nuptials, and can also be entered into if you're not marrying at all. So essentially, it's a binding financial agreement entered into between two couples who are, it's not two couples, that'd be weird, one couple between two parties who are either marrying or married, or who are going to or are already living together, who want to provide for what should happen between them in the event they separate. So essentially, they're quite common now with people who maybe are getting married when they're, or starting to live together when they're a little bit older and might have a lot of assets, or one of them might, that they want to protect. And also very common in second marriages or second lengthy relationships, where maybe people have already been burned by the family law process once, and they want to make sure that if this new relationship should separate, that they will be able to take out of the relationship what they brought into it.
Okay.
Does that kind of make sense?
Yes, it does. It does. Now, I had a conversation with Mark Cam, who was telling me about his French perspective on relationships and marriage. And he said, back in France, it's very normal to get a prenup. Everyone gets a prenup like donuts, just handing them out. In Australia, it's a little bit different. Can you...
Yeah.
So explain, I guess, for couples who now know what a prenup is, or already did, why would they get one? I guess don't sell it, but explain why get one.
Sure. So I guess they're particularly good in situations where perhaps one part of the couple or both of them maybe are being given some money by family, or are likely to receive a large inheritance, and they're wanting to protect the family wealth. That's quite a common reason. Particularly often parents will actually suggest that their children do that, or will make a gift of money contingent on saying, hang on a minute, I want to know that if you separate from him or her, this money is going to stay with our family and not be lost, which can happen otherwise. So that's one reason. Again, if people have perhaps developed a business, or they have amassed a great deal of wealth before they enter into the relationship and they're wanting to protect that. The best way to do that is to enter into this sort of binding financial agreement arrangement. Or, as I said, if people are wanting to maybe protect their assets for their children, if they're coming to it as a second relationship, and they're wanting to make sure that in the event it breaks down, that wealth, which maybe came from the husband and the wife being the children's parents, will not be diluted and part of it taken by the new partner in the event of separation. I think that if you're maybe a typical kind of young in love couple and neither of you have any assets, and there's not going to be great family wealth that's gifted or likely to be inherited, you mightn't bother. But I think that in those cases that I've mentioned, it's particularly worthwhile exercise, because while there's never any guarantees in family law that things will be 100% binding, you're much better off to create the hurdle of an agreement, which creates something that the spouse would need to overcome if you separate, rather than having nothing at all.
Okay. So for a couple who, as you said, perhaps young, don't have that many assets, potentially aren't really having a major inheritance coming their way, it's probably something that they don't necessarily need to look at.
It's something that they wouldn't need to look at that point. I think it's something, because you can enter them after you've already commenced living together or after you've already been married, then I think that it's definitely worth considering down the track if those circumstances arose such that there was a big inheritance or a gift of money from family coming or something like that. It's not a kind of set and forget arrangement. You could consider it down the track. I think that sometimes that would be hard to discuss as part of a relationship, but it's certainly doable. But it's not something that you'd probably need prior to your wedding, and if that was your circumstance. If you were just kind of young, didn't have many assets, it's not something that you'd need to worry about at that point. So not like the French. If you're saying the French kind of just do it as a matter of course, wouldn't need to here.
Okay. Do you feel like most couples don't, and I would actually know, I don't ask my couples whether they do or not. I still feel like there's probably a more general consensus that, and maybe I'm wrong on this and feel free to correct me, people feel like getting a prenup is almost like it's a sign of doubt. It's sort of like, oh, geez, the boat's already rocking. This is a bad sign. What would speak to that?
I think that's a great point, and the romantic in me completely agrees with that.
Sure.
I think it's interesting actually, because I've noticed sometimes when I'm doing them with couples that it really brings up issues that might already be there. And I think, in fact, it can be a great exercise in really kind of understanding your partner and seeing what's important to them.
Sure.
That's somewhat digressing from your question. As for kind of how you would sell it and whether you should do it and is it unromantic, yes, it is, but you make a will. I mean, you will definitely die. You won't definitely separate. But I think it depends on if you've got a significant sum that you're wanting to protect. It's not planning to fail. It's just planning to avoid a big argument in the event that you do happen to not succeed. And my experience is that particularly it's pretty easy in second marriages to do that. It's sometimes harder in a first relationship where people maybe are a little bit younger. It becomes more complicated as well, because then there's the issue of, well, you might do one thing if you separate not having had children, but you might do another thing if you're separating having had children. The conversations can become quite messy.
Yeah, okay.
But I think that it's better to have a financial agreement if you're going to be worried about it than to live your life trying to protect your assets as part of your relationship.
Yeah.
You know, I had a woman once who was, and this isn't quite right from a legal perspective, but she was kind of in tears at the thought of, can I let him mow my lawn? If he mows my lawn, does that give him some entitlement to my property? And no, it doesn't. But, you know, that's where it is better to just do it, put it aside, forget that it's done, and not have to worry.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. I think
not romantic, but wise.
No, I get that. And I think a lot of weddings in Australia are based on that love, on romance. Very rarely do people say, you know, this is a fantastic strategic alliance. Let us form families and, you know, all that. it is normally that we fell in love when we met and we just seemed right and it felt right and everything just never felt this way with anyone else before. I'm committing my life to them. And I get that sort of causes.
Oh my God. And that's so beautiful.
I know. Am I right? I love hearing that. It is beautiful. Well, why don't you speak into, because a lot of your time is spent helping people rebuild in your life, but part of that is divorcing. Tell us, what is your view on marriage?
I think that marriage is, I think it's a beautiful thing. I think that whereas once it could be beneficial from a legal perspective, that's no longer the case, because from a separation perspective, certainly we divide assets in the same way now, whether people are de facto or whether they're married. I think that there are still some non-family law aspects, such as wills and estates and superannuation beneficiaries and various things where perhaps for same-sex couples, for example, marriage still gives you some entitlements that you wouldn't have if you weren't married. From a psychological or kind of romance perspective, I still think that there's something lovely about the public declaration of your love. And whether, I guess, that be a commitment ceremony or a formal marriage, I still think it's a really beautiful thing to do. And I think there's something about the ceremony of it, whatever it looks like and whether or not you're signing a marriage certificate, that is just a lovely way to say, hey, this is my person.
Yeah.
You know it because you've seen us together and you know we're together, but look, we're having a big celebration of our love. How beautiful is that? I do think that sometimes people get too much caught up in the wedding and not enough in the marriage. And it's really the marriage, i.e. the union of the two, that's kind of more important than how you look and what you do and how many people you have and how much money you spend.
Yeah.
I think that there's that component. That's, I suppose, about weddings rather than about marriage. I think that marriage is awesome.
Yeah. Cool. And you are married yourself?
I am, yes.
You are, yeah. I just thought I would add, I knew you were, but I thought I'd add that in for others. I might be wondering, that's her view, but is she? Yeah.
Yes, she is. And she's proud to be. And I did kind of feel different when I got married from having been de facto to being married. I think there is that kind of moment of, yes, we're actually publicly declaring what we privately know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned that there wasn't a big difference. Let's just talk about in terms of that separation of assets, whether you are married or de facto. Are there any other differences legally? If someone was saying, well, I don't see the point of getting married. We've been living with each other for X amount of years.
I think that if you are a heterosexual couple, I think that now, and I don't know every area of law, but in my experience, there's no general life area where you're necessarily better off being married than being de facto. I do think, as I said, from a same-sex couple perspective, I believe that there are still differences.
Can you talk to us a little bit about that? Like what are some of those differences that are...
Well, my understanding, and again, Pete, this is not exactly my area, but my recollection when last I heard is that there were still some issues about, for example, around being next of kin in terms of if somebody's dying in hospital, around who they would listen to. I think that there still can be some issues from a same-sex perspective. I think that there may be some issues in relation to beneficiary of superannuation fund type issues. But again, I'm sorry to be vague, but I haven't had to know the specifics of it. But just my recollection is that there are still some small aspects where, from a same-sex perspective in particular, it's problematic if you're not married.
Okay.
But certainly from the area that I know, which is around how are your assets going to be divided if you separate, no difference anymore, except insofar as, minor differences if it's a short relationship. Some minutiae that I won't bother your lovely listeners with. But if somebody is in a de facto relationship and concerned about separating, they should get family law advice.
And we advise them too. How can couples and the individuals within that relationship set themselves up for a healthy marriage?
I think they should have a lot of conversation before they get into it. We, from time to time, have provided some kind of thoughtful tips for things that people might want to discuss. For example, like basics, like if somebody is offered a job interstate, how is the couple going to handle that? Is somebody a workaholic? How is the couple going to handle somebody actually being at work from, 6 a.m. till 10 p.m.? Are they congruent in terms of their life values? Does one want to be the provider and the other one wants to stay at home, or do they both want to do one of those roles, and how is that going to work? What is going to happen if, I don't know, your in-laws are wanting to spend all of their time at your house? How's that going to work? How are you going to play that out? I think that there are a lot of these sort of fundamental conversations, which when you're kind of just young and not necessarily young, in that first flush of love, you get along well, you're passionate, you don't necessarily discuss the big what ifs. And certainly from my perspective, we see that a lot of those what ifs are things that can end a relationship down the track, particularly, for example, my examples there of the interstate travel, say, or long hours at work, misconceptions around how the family is going to be built. Those sorts of things can really erode what was otherwise a strong base. So I think the more you talk, the more you learn about each other and your life goals, even though it maybe feels weird to sit down and discuss those things, I think that it's worth it, because it's better to know early. And same thing happens, as I said, when we do the prenuptial type agreements, to get a real understanding of the way that your partner thinks about money and the way that they value you, not just financially, but emotionally, and where do you fit in their kind of brain and their life plan. I think that those things are really important and would save a lot of couples from kind of continuing on and on and on and then hitting a speed bump.
What are your thoughts on pre-marriage counselling?
I think it's brilliant. I think that it would put a lot of people off. I think that we're not great at accepting psychological help and counselling in Australia. I know that in the States, for example, everybody seems to have a therapist. I think that also because we also are not great at accepting, extramarital affairs in Australia, for example, whereas to your French perspective, of course, there it's quite common that they would have a mistress. I think that there are a lot of things culturally that are accepted in other places that aren't accepted here. And I think that it makes counselling all the more important, because the counsellor can help raise all of those issues that I've just spoken about. You can talk about it early and work out whether you're actually compatible or not. Yeah.
As a celebrant, we need to raise and recommend marriage counselling with them. And it's definitely one that's still, every couple is different. And I think the majority of the feeling I get that comes back is there's nothing wrong with us. Why would we need to go get it? But for us, we possibly have similar thoughts to it, because Grace and I did go get some pre-marriage counselling. We found it extremely beneficial, is that it simply directed a conversation and it gave us space within that time and those feelings to talk about just some mundane things that you might have current expectations with kids and, like you said, how are we going to raise the family and over the different years. And it might be strange, like, hey, let's sit down tonight and talk about this. But because it created a space to talk about that, you go in with the similar expectations. So it sounds like what you're advising is have those conversations.
I think it's really great to create space for it. And I think that you're going to do that better if you do that with kind of a third person to facilitate. And I know there are online courses and things now, so it doesn't necessarily have to be a big deal, but with somebody or something that's going to prompt the right conversations. I do think it's worthwhile. Maybe people would kind of overlook things because if they are in that flush of love, and I suppose particularly if they're doing it at the point that they're choosing a celebrant, it may be, ironically, is kind of almost too late because they'd be so committed at that stage.
Sure.
But I think that generally, I can't speak highly enough about the concept. I think it's really worthwhile.
What do you wish couples knew before getting married? Because I feel
wish
like,
they knew.
I just want to say I ask that question because you see so many couples at the end of the sort of like on the wedding day. It's a thing like you don't even. No one talks about that. No one talks. The D word is not talked about.
Of course not.
No, you don't talk about divorce. Obviously, the day is about union, getting married, having a wedding, having an epic party. That's what is on people's minds. And you see the divorce. You're part of that. And I just wonder if in so many of those you see just some common things. I just wish people would think of this or do this or try this. I don't know.
Well, I just wish that people would, the first thing that comes to mind, Pete, is that I just wish that people would take notice of the red flags, because so many of my clients say, I knew that they were this or that. I mean, at the extreme end, I knew that they were abusive, but kind of at a lesser, I knew that they were rigid, or I knew that they were workaholic, or I knew that we actually had nothing in common, or I knew that blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
And then, you know, that's always followed by, but I stuck with it.
Yeah.
And really, I feel like if it's hard work, it's wrong. You should get out. That's my feeling, is that if it's, I mean, yes, a relationship, of course, is work. Once you're in it, once you're committed and it's for the long haul, you should work in it, I think. But if it's kind of new, and these people often are talking about kind of in the first flush of that romance when they're kind of really wooing each other, something's not right. And I feel like if at that stage it doesn't just flow, doesn't really bode well for the rest of the relationship.
Yeah.
What do you think?
I do have similar feelings. You know, being in a few serious relationships before, and it didn't flow. And I just thought, like, I get it. Everyone says it takes work to build this, and I get that. But I think there is something in particularly those, let's just say at least the first 3 years, it should be pretty easy. It should, like,
yes,
from a hormonal perspective, everything's up.
It should be all happening. Yes.
Rose-colored glasses, you know.
Yes.
It should be just easy fun, easy times, little bits, and, you know, just dealing with things and getting to know each other. But I agree with you. If it's a bit of a grind at the start, I think that's a sign that perhaps something isn't right, and either something just needs to be addressed and talked about and dealt with, or, like you're saying, maybe there are some red flags that need to be talked about and need to be thought about.
I'm a big watcher of romantic comedies, and I'm just thinking, how many times, even apart from real life, how many times though do you see in a movie, because you don't get to necessarily examine your friends' relationships closely necessarily, but in movies you see so many times these heartbroken women with, he left me and he said he didn't want to get married and now he's getting married, you know, that kind of stuff, right? Because their relationship wasn't right, and then they found one where it was right. And when it's right, I think you know, because it flows, because it's easy. And if it's a chore, and if it doesn't just feel like you want to be in it, and that it's kind of immersing you in fabulousness, I think you need to consider seriously whether it's where you want to be.
One thing I hear a lot from couples is when they talk about how easy it is to talk with this person, and that they haven't found that with others. Like, there's a particular ease where you can just be yourself. You don't need to wear a mask. It's just, I can just be who I am, and I know they accept me and I accept them, and it works. So I think there is something to that ease, but there is that balance in the background of going, but it does take work as well. It does take an effort. Well,
I think it takes work insofar as if somebody gets sick or loses their job or there's family stresses or whatever it is, you have to work through that.
Yeah.
But if it's kind of, you can never agree on what to have for dinner, and you never want to watch the same things on TV, and you don't like each other's friends, well, you know, maybe that means you shouldn't be together.
That's a lot of life stuff, friends, TV.
You know what I mean?
You're doing a lot of that on a daily basis. So,
but if it's, you know, and they're kind of low level things, but yet in terms of the work, I think you work through problems together, but you shouldn't have to work at, like, for example, I feel like, you know, people often play games in the early phase of dating. I think if it's meant to be, you won't need to play games, because the other person's going to want to move at the same pace as you. You want to see them every day, they'll probably want to see you every day too, you know? And if you have to pretend, no, I'm cool, I don't mind if you don't ring me for a week, well, it's not your person, I think.
Okay, so let's talk about, say, just for example, there is one of the couples right now, one of them, the bride or the groom, are sitting there and they're listening to this, and they're going, they're pressing on something. There are some red flags that I've been trying to avoid, but there's something in me going, I've needed to hear this. What do you recommend? Like, what are your thoughts? What would you say to them? Counselling.
Go together, have this premarital type counselling that we're talking about. Or if you feel like you can't raise it with your partner, then go and have some counselling yourself, and talk it through with somebody completely neutral and independent, and see whether these red flags are just kind of pre-wedding jitters, or whether they're actually serious things that might become an issue. And probably ultimately you're going to need to talk them through with your partner, because if you can't, then you've got to question the strength of that relationship anyway. But do it. Don't just push them to the back of your mind and jump in and hope that it'll be all fine, because it does become more complicated the longer you're together, not just from a legal perspective, but from a life perspective. Not to mention, if you're having and if they're your customers, clients, then they are about to have a wedding. When we're out of lockdown, they might even be having a big, fat, expensive wedding. Why spend tens of thousands of dollars on a wedding for a relationship that's not going to work?
Yeah.
Not to mention the personal investment and emotional commitment. Yeah.
Yep.
So listen to the flags. Listen to the flags, look at the flags. Take note of them.
Take note, look at the flags. And we could be real corny and say, listen to your heart. I would never say that in a ceremony.
Oh my God, and then I could even cornier and start singing that song about listening to your heart. But I'll spare your listeners that, Pete.
I'd be okay if you wanted to break out into solo. Is there anything else in terms of the legalities that you feel are important to touch upon?
I think that if you fall into the category of having already amassed a lot of assets or being likely to be given or inherit family wealth, you might want to have a conversation with a family lawyer, potentially, about what that will look like in the event that you separate and you don't have an agreement to protect those things.
Yeah.
Again, it's not romantic, but it's sensible, I think. And I think that otherwise, it's really then just a matter of living your life. But if you fall into those categories, get advice early. Get it while you're in there. I mean, you do so much wedding preparation, people do, no matter what size their wedding is.
Yep.
Oh, and God, you're so lucky to work with people on that end. Oh, so beautiful.
It's a very happy end down here. Rainbows and butterflies.
Don't just do wedding preparation, do marriage preparation and do life preparation. Whether that's around the legal side or whether that's just around those big picture questions that we discussed before.
Yeah.
Prepare not just for the fun, but also for the work.
Yep. Yeah, I think sometimes the word, look, wedding is a much more attractive word than marriage.
Yes, so much so.
So much so, which is why the big focus is on the wedding. But what makes the wedding even better is when you have done a bit of prep in terms of the marriage, and whether that's just conversations, which really is just conversations about life. And even if it's going like, oh, we don't agree on that, but realizing that, well, that's okay. We can actually come to a different agreement and realize that we had different expectations, but way better we had this conversation now than had, a conversation 5-10 years down the track. That's like, but you said this, like, I never said this is what life would look like. So let's finish on then. What is your best advice for couples? And feel free if there's something legal and then maybe perhaps something relational from your own marriage you want to, but I'll just leave it open to you. Your best advice for couples.
I think really in all aspects, it's about trust your gut. If a gut is telling you that something is amazing or that you don't need to worry about protecting your assets or that you definitely want to marry them, then probably your gut's right. But if your gut is saying, oh, I'm wondering if maybe I should think about protecting in case we separate, or I wonder if, do I really like that they work such long hours or only want to live in Melbourne when really my heart says I should live in Sydney, then explore those things further. Don't be afraid to get some advice is really the bottom line about whatever aspect of your relationship. If you've got questions, if your gut is questioning something, seek help.
Okay. Wonderful. Jane, thank you so much for your time. How can people find you?
They can contact me via www.umbrellafamilylaw.com.au. They can remember if they're in pain in the rain, they should call Jane.
I love
Umbrella
that.
Family Law.
I was just about to say, please tell us your line.
So great chatting with you about love, Pete. Really wonderful.
Cool. You too, Jane. It's been so good to see you. And everyone, I hope that you were able to take so much from that, whether you need to go get a prenup or not. But I know both Jane and I really agree. Have those life conversations with the person you intend to do life with before the wedding day. And if you're already married, hey, better still, have that conversation. Jane, thank you so much.
Never too late to start. Thank you, Pete. Absolute pleasure.
Okay, see you, Jane. And thank you for joining us, everyone. Farewell. Bye.
Cause